Hi everybody, welcome to the WHU Most Awesome Founder podcast, a show about entrepreneurs, innovators, advisors and educators and the story that make them who they are today. I'm your host Dries Stephan, and today I'm happy to have again with me Gerrit McGowan as the co-host. Today we welcome to the podcast Ute Stephan, entrepreneurship professor at King's Business School in London and one of the leading academic experts on the topic of entrepreneurial well-being, stress, and health. Ute, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to your questions.
Great. And we always start with the same question, namely, we always want to hear some personal storytelling about your background. So can you maybe briefly tell something about where you're coming from, how you ended up in London? That would be nice.
Right. I'm originally German, and I actually am a trained psychologist. So that probably explains a little bit my interest in health and well-being. And I kind of moved over the years slowly west, so to speak. So I started out in Dresden, spent some time studying also in UT Austin in Texas, and then kind of moved to Marburg, where I did my PhD in 2008 in psychology, actually work psychology, but entrepreneurship. And by then, I had already published some research on entrepreneurs' well-being and health. We did an early study also with biomarkers, but it wasn't really a topic of interest. And then, so my personal journey kind of went on. I also got interested, because I lived in different countries, worked with people from all over the world, into how entrepreneurship looks different around the world. I spent some time at KU Leuven. I think, Dries, that's where we met some time ago. And then I kind of moved eventually to the UK. I held appointments at various universities in the UK, but since 2018, I'm at King's Business School and very happy there. And so maybe it's strange mix, a psychologist who's interested in entrepreneurship. At least that's what my psychology colleagues used to tell me, because most of work psychology deals with people at work who are employed by others, and most of clinical psychology doesn't necessarily consider work but focuses more on the ill-being. And so I'm trying to be a hopeful person. So I'm really interested in how actually work can make us thrive, be some source of meaning in our life, gives us purpose. And that's where you quite quickly arrive at maybe entrepreneurship is not such a bad thing. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this. Yes, it has a lot of stress and strain, but it also seems to kind of give you, a sense of freedom, of being in control about, the things you do, how you're going to shape your work, with whom you work. And so, there seemed to be this puzzle that it's probably very good, but probably also very stressful. And for a little while, I was an entrepreneur myself. And I think I experienced really this, your work suddenly find yourself working late in the night and you don't mind because somehow it's interesting, meaningful what you're doing. But then you're still exhausted the next day. And then if the great proposal you worked on for a client and the client tells you, I'm not interested, then somehow you feel, well, it's not just about your work. Suddenly it's also about you, yourself as a person. So it seems to kind of involve the whole person. And I might just stop there.
Ute, but I want to ask a question that I ask a lot of entrepreneurs that come on the show, because you have an interesting trajectory. It's actually the complete inverse of mine, where I've been an entrepreneur my whole life that got obsessed with psychology and neuroscience after kind of my own burnout and my own health struggles through one of those journeys and my wife is a psychologist and neuroscientist, and she just doesn't get what I do and has very, very little interest in it. So what inspired a psychologist to look at this weird segment of society of entrepreneurs? What drove you in that direction as opposed to all of the other cool places you could have gone?
So I think it's going to be an entrepreneurial answer in a sense. There is a lot of serendipity involved. When I came back from the US and I was still studying in Dresden, and then suddenly there was this project that Peter Richter, one of my mentors, led, and it was about entrepreneurship at the eve of the EU extension. So we're going back quite a while, 2004. The EU extended east, kind of taking in a lot of countries at once, including Poland and Czech Republic. And then in 2007, also Bulgaria and Romania were added. And so the interesting thing about that setting is that actually post-communist countries, and communism itself, was very anti-entrepreneurial. So I was intrigued how in a culture that basically tells you, we're not interested in you doing your own thing, you're supposed to fall in line and, obey orders effectively, how you can, in that sort of environment, forge your own path in life and be an entrepreneur. And there was a lot of bright but also very dark entrepreneurial efforts at the time, but it was very interesting. And what also was striking, that in all these different countries where we spoke to entrepreneurs, be it in Bulgaria, Poland, Czech Republic, in Germany, they all had one of the same challenges. When we asked them, what you're doing for your health, for your well-being, the answer was, I just try and get enough sleep. So, and then, if they were maybe a little bit more cognizant or had kind of afforded themselves to spend a bit more time thinking about the topic, was, well, I'm also trying to do sport, and I'm trying somehow to also leave some space in my life for kind of, a life, so to speak, for a private life. So in a sense that, the challenges were similar everywhere, and also the expectations. We did a lot of work on societal expectations, and they were always the same, right? These are the people who we expect to work hard, and, they're basically almost they shouldn't complain about any of the stresses because they choose their own path. So, this is what you have to put up with. And, you get big returns for that, allegedly, because we do know that on average, entrepreneurs actually don't earn much more than if with their skill set they were employed. So, this is kind of one of the puzzles of why are people entrepreneurs? It's for a multitude of reasons. But certainly one thing that all entrepreneurs seem to share is that they find their job very fulfilling and meaningful. And so that's one of the, how we say in our jargon, non-economic or non-pecuniary benefits of entrepreneurship.
You bring up an interesting topic. I spent the first part of my career as a development economist. So I worked a lot with informal sector entrepreneurs in Africa in particular. And as I kind of went into my PhD research on well-being and performance, I've definitely had a couple times where I questioned myself, like, am I tackling a first world problem here? Like, how do you find, as someone that has kind of explored entrepreneurship in different contexts around the world, do you see that this topic of well-being and burnout and some of these other kind of psychological struggles that entrepreneurs have, do you see the same patterns in emerging markets or kind of at the bottom of the pyramid type entrepreneurs?
It's a very good question. And I think to some degree, I would agree. It is a bit of a first world problem, but it also shows that, when we allow humans to flourish, then we also tend to kind of talk more about the vulnerabilities. And in a sense, in emerging markets or base of the pyramid settings, you don't have that luxury. And what we do see, though, is we've just done a big meta study, 40 years of research, and we could compile and actually look at well-being of entrepreneurs relative to being employed across 82 countries. And what we very clearly saw is it's much better to be an entrepreneur in a developed setting compared to a base of the pyramid, and more generally in emerging markets where things are just a lot more volatile, a lot more uncertain. And if you, in your own work, every day anyways have to navigate a lot of uncertainty and risks and, insecurities about where you go, whether this customer says yes or no, and how, clients might react and so forth. And then you compound that with not being able to know what's going to happen in your environment the next week or maybe even the next day. If you're successful, then you might have, various people knocking at your door who want a share of that success, not legitimately. You can't go to a court, or you can go to a court, but it may take over a year to get your case heard. By that time, you're bankrupt. So I think once you add all of those layers of uncertainty on, it's not surprisingly that in being an entrepreneur in the base of the pyramid or even in emerging markets is extra challenging. And we do see that in that setting, entrepreneurs have very high stress levels. They're still, and it's the interesting paradox, they're still also getting happiness from their work, but they're at the same time a lot more stressed compared to those in a more developed, more secure setting.
Ute, you were mentioning that you did recently a meta-analysis, which I think is always interesting because this kind of studies, meta-analysis means you're not doing your own research, but you're kind of compiling all the research on a certain topic and trying to identify patterns. So what are the patterns? What kind of overarching patterns do we see in the research on entrepreneurs and well-being? Can you share some of the insights that you're generating based on this meta-analysis?
Sure. And at the risk of talking far too long about this, I'm going to try. So the main message, it's always a challenge for academics. Yes. The main message is, the main question we asked is, are you happier working for yourself compared to working for somebody else? So as an entrepreneur or as an employee. And the bottom line is yes. So you are happier, but there's always a but. It does depend also. So happiness isn't just one thing. And this is what we were trying to do with the study and also to show is that all the research typically looks at something called subjective well-being, which is measured as life or job satisfaction. So if I ask you, how satisfied are you with your job on a scale from 1 to 10, how happy or unsatisfied are you with your life? And so on those measures, entrepreneurs in any context are better off, except what we call necessity entrepreneurs. So, the ones who are forced into entrepreneurship because they have no alternative employment options. And then the other side of the coin, if you wish, is more kind of stress-based measures. So do you feel exhausted? Do you feel overwhelmed by what you're doing? Do you have a lot of anxiety? Do you feel depressed? And on those measures, we find really that's sensitive to context. So on average, entrepreneurs don't appear to be more stressed, but in kind of uncertain contexts, they are also more stressed. So they have both greater happiness, but also greater stress. And so I have one big caveat, though. I believe those findings, but I would really love for research, and Gerrit, you brought already up physiological measures. I would really like kind of to be able to do a meta-analysis on also physiological measures, because there is one pattern we tend to see is that it's much harder for an entrepreneur to acknowledge that they're stressed and not in control when everything around them is geared up towards telling them you are in charge, right? So there might be, it seems from some emerging research that physiologically they are more stressed, but they're not necessarily cognizant of that, right? They're not necessarily reporting that they are feeling more stressed because of the setting they're in. So take
and they may be cognizant.
Or maybe
they may be cognizant as well, because there is, at least in our part of the world, there's this expectation that the entrepreneurs are large and in charge. And, my research, we were looking at heart rate variability data to try to get some objective markers coming out of that. And oftentimes it was completely misaligned with the self-reporting that took place there. And that actually just brings me to one other question in relation, because why would entrepreneurs kind of fake it till you make it, if you will, in that regard? And you had mentioned you'd kind of defined these entrepreneurs as working for themselves versus working for others. I was studying, and I work mostly with venture-backed entrepreneurs. And once they start taking venture capital, you start losing a little bit this sense of autonomy in that journey, and now you're accountable to others. And I don't know if has that been something that you've explored at all? Like, would you even consider them still entrepreneurs when they no longer own the cap table of their own business and they're accountable to other external forces?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I've done a little bit of research in other settings about that, but I think we're not acknowledging actually. So, if you want the ideal high fly success scenario, and also what policymakers often want in terms of high growth entrepreneurship unicorns, is, you have an idea, you get VC backed funding ideally, and then you go very big and create lots of jobs and hopefully, or maybe also a lot of wealth for the people involved invested in you. But what we don't appreciate is that actually that process can take away a lot of your control, and also a lot of then the very reason why you started out doing things. And because the public image is maybe more about, oh, they earn a lot of money and that's it. But if we start recognizing, and I guess this is my psychological perspective, we keep finding in different contexts that entrepreneurs care about money. Maybe some small segment just cares about money, but there is a large segment that cares much more about having fulfilling work, feeling very beholden to the employees they employ, because they know, often not just the employees, but also their families. And also we see, including in setting where everything is stacked against entrepreneurship and also against charity, we see entrepreneurs really kind of caring about their community and trying to give back, either through charity, so a bit separate from their business, but increasingly also kind of trying to ingrain kind of some social purpose in their business. So to me, always, I think there is a real disconnect. What our data shows us, what entrepreneurs care about, which is very rich and, makes sense. They are human beings. As human beings, we have many goals in life. Many different things are important to us, and how they are depicted often, and how policymakers also design instruments for supporting them on a very kind of narrow view of entrepreneurs as, driven and incentivized by money.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting topic. I like to work with and invest in entrepreneurs that, tend to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And there's an analogy, if you play, for anyone out there that plays poker, it's called the short stack advantage. So when your chips are dwindling and they're getting shorter and shorter, you're kind of forced by the odds to play more aggressively. And that kind of triggers this perspective of, acceptable losses and what you're able and willing to lose. And sometimes the entrepreneurs that have very little to begin with have a different risk profile because they've already been where they could end up going again. And I know from my experiences, I started raising more venture capital and the business got larger and I had more and more employees. The stress wasn't about me. I think the empath in me kicked in, and it became much more about this sense of responsibility for all of the people that worked for me and the people that believed in me and invested in me. And in some sense, the more successful and the more we grew, the greater the burden, emotional burden that I kind of carried with me. Do you think that's a pattern that is consistent?
I think that's almost exactly what I heard from a lot of entrepreneurs when we did our study during COVID. So we did a large global survey of entrepreneurs during COVID, effectively over 7,000 in 28 countries. And what was striking was that the types of patterns that they, we did survey, but also kind of asked them a bit more about the actual challenges, and then followed up with quite a few of them over 14 days. They spoke to us every evening. So, which is really interesting to see. The life challenges are interesting for us, but very humbling also to hear. And there were a lot of those challenges that as soon as they had employees, it was literally with COVID and the economy locking down. It's not just that, my job is on the line and my family home, because that's the collateral for the business. And my wife also happens to work in the business, was a common trajectory, or my partner. It was then also, but I also have to face the real possibility of having to lay off the employees whose families I also know, and I can't really, compute that in my mind. I don't know how to deal with that. So it's this deep sense of responsibility if you go beyond yourself. And in a sense, for the self-employed, the challenges are different. I'm not saying they're less, but they have different challenges. But certainly if you employ others, that's a really big pressure.
The COVID piece is very interesting to me, because when I first started doing my study, it was with the founders in Techstars Berlin, and we started collecting the data, and then the first COVID lockdown happened, and they all got locked down in their apartments. And interestingly, I was I was getting them to self-report on flow, so kind of optimal peak experiences, and their performance went through the roof. Like they started performing better and better and better and better. Now, granted, they didn't have the same distractions that they had prior to the lockdown, so they could sit at home in their own comfortable environment and work at their own schedules. But I would my hypothesis behind that is these were early stage startups. So it was literally just the founder teams at that point. So they didn't have maybe as much of a burden of responsibility for having brought others into their sphere at that point.
And I think that, plus they're probably also in a much better place to take advantage of opportunities, because we shouldn't forget that a load of businesses suffered. So in our study, 60% said they face a real threat to the survival of the business. But there was also a lot of businesses who really went through the roof, right? Who took advantage of the opportunities. Not necessarily good for the entrepreneur's well-being either, because, they didn't have a weekend any longer and just worked all the time. But if you are early stage, you're a little bit more flexible and, can more easily pivot. And certainly there were some opportunities, and also some opportunities that, a lot of entrepreneurs found very meaningful, as in helping in one shape or form the whole COVID effort, where it felt suddenly you're part of something bigger, and that really was motivating.
Maybe, Ute, I maybe want to shift a bit from kind of diagnosing the problem to coming to the solutions, because now we have talked about how being an entrepreneur on the one hand is nice because you have a lot of autonomy, you have control over your work, but at the same time it comes at a cost, namely stress, especially when you're in the VC-backed kind of environment and where the risk of burnout is looming. So my question would be, what do we know from the research on kind of how to avoid that you end up in a burnout? What kind of strategies, interventions can we implement to deal with the stress that is maybe inherently there, but at least that it does not start affecting your mental health and can trigger depression or whatever?
I think, so the first thing is to say that there's no one strategy, because it depends a bit on the type of entrepreneur and also on the type of person you are. But if you kind of consider that on average, you have to have a certain sense of achievement motivation to get into entrepreneurship. And so you want to do things, you want to be successful. And also when you are successful, you get a huge boost for your well-being, and a real energy boost, because it's due to you. At the same time, nobody is going to pat you on the back and say, well done, because you don't have this, leader you report to. So you have to create your own incentives in a way, because otherwise you can always do more, right? You can always have more market share. You can always add more employees. You can always do more. And so you at risk of getting into nothing is ever good enough and I need to work more. And so to not get into this hamster wheel, which is why I'm doing this with my fingers, is to kind of make sure that you have set your own goals so that you know when you're successful. And importantly, that you can actually celebrate those successes, right? And say, now I have achieved that much revenue. That's great. Actually, that's what I wanted to achieve at the end of the year. We're only in month 7 and, you should go out and celebrate. So really kind of to keep yourself motivated, but also to give yourself these experiences of, oh, this is great and this is rewarding. And then the other element is because you don't have any clear boundaries, right? With autonomy comes also the option to work whenever for how long you want, late into the night and so forth. And so what we know from research more generally is that stress can be short-term, great, performance enhancing. And so you might not mind the one night, maybe even the 2 nights, and you get, an energy boost because you feel you've achieved something, sent something off, maybe got even positive feedback on it. But in the long term, these high levels of stress, we know, just wear the body out. So there's nice studies that they're looking at something called allostatic load, which is basically an early response. So a state that we don't necessarily feel yet. We're also not clinically ill yet, but it's the way to illness, so to speak. And we know that entrepreneurs are more often, so they have higher allostatic load than employees. So one of the things you can do is just build up routines that allow you to deal with the stress, as in give yourself a little bit of space to recover and to push the allostatic load down, so to speak, so that you're in the long term not at risk of illness. So it's not one thing, it's not one kind of quick fix. But the nice thing is it's also not a huge thing that you need to add now to your to-do list, because it is about building up these little routines that, maybe we know that sleep is important, so that you actually give yourself a time when you stop working, do deliberately something else to be able to detach from work and really get high quality sleep. And so a lot of this is about routines and kind of, going to bed at always the same time, waking up at always the same time, but also throughout your workday, trying to build routines, as in, nobody is structuring the day for you. So kind of try and restructure your day. That can you maybe go for a little small walk in the morning or at lunchtime, so that you get a bit of exercise as well. And actually research shows that if you take over an hour, a 5-minute mini break every hour, and you can train yourself that you're almost more productive because you know that this break is coming. And you detach even for 5 minutes, and you'll be surprised if you've worked on a problem maybe and were stuck. If you come back after those 5 minutes, even then you already have new ideas. And so what we also find is that all of these things, which sound like, maybe it's just nice to look after my well-being, we find that those things, including high quality sleep, actually makes you more creative as an entrepreneur. So we fitted entrepreneurs with sleep trackers because, objective sleep quality is quite good to measure, because it doesn't necessarily correlate with how you subjectively experience your sleep. And we found that on nights where the entrepreneurs slept more, had higher quality sleep, the next day they actually were more creative in their business. So it's not a trade-off, but it really is an investment in yourself, in your own productivity, and therefore in your business, as in your business success, in your business creativity and innovation potential.
Wow, you talked about so many things I want to ask about there. Because I think a lot of these topics to me have kind of are two-sided coins that get really interesting for the entrepreneur in practice. Like for example, you kind of talked about something like a Pomodoro technique, right? Where you take a break for 5 minutes and then you work for a while. And I think the other side of that coin is that, you start getting into deep focus and then you break that focus. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs will push back on those types of strategies and say, hey, it took me 45 minutes to get into the groove. I'm finally in the groove. I don't want to take a break because I'm kind of rolling there, and I think you talked about two fundamental pieces, which are motivation and goals. And goals are such an interesting, I think, an interesting framework to think about from the entrepreneurial perspective, right? Because it's super important to have these North Stars and to have these small wins that you create along the way. The problem is I think people don't know how to set them very effectively. And as a result, they set goals that they consistently don't achieve because they're operating in environments of uncertainty, which thus leads to greater stresses, which thus leads to less sleep. And then you start getting this feedback loop that becomes really problematic. So I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and teach them to set OKRs, right? Where the goals are not set in stone and they need to be adaptable over time. I mean, do you find any kind of specific techniques like that can be effective in kind of not so much in the lifestyle side, but priming yourself psychologically for the experience? It's like motivation, understanding the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, understanding what goals are good, what aren't, how to kind of differentiate between the pitfalls that can arise from those topics and the positive directions.
I think on a general level, it's always good, especially in the early stages, to get mentoring, because, experienced entrepreneurs have done that, have been there. They know that, okay, you're not going to take over the world next year. And, you're not going to get to $1 million revenue next year either. So I think it's good to kind of have these touch points, and actually the same almost with your well-being. It may not be the mentors, depending on how sensitive they are to the well-being topic. Although most VCs, if they've been entrepreneurs themselves, they will have stories of burnout as well. So it's just nothing that is necessarily talked about. But also, people close to you can be quite a good gauge for your own well-being. So kind of saying, oh, maybe, you're not enjoying this any longer. You just seem to work. You feel guilty when you're not working. And, kind of trying to push through. You're not really celebrating any achievements and any milestones any longer. So what's going on? So these are all the early signs that kind of take you eventually to burnout. So it's about spotting those early signs. If you're consistently not sleeping well, kind of trying to take a step back and think, okay, is this actually working for me? And what I find, depends on the individual. It can be quite useful. So I like tracking all sorts of things. I have a sleep tracker because I don't believe, myself. And then if you see these trends and you see also your resting heart rate going up and up and up, you kind of have a signal that maybe I need to change something. And it's really, I think the key for me is to get in, be clear about that. Your well-being isn't really something that's separate, but it's really a value driver of your business. And I think once you have that clear in your mind, it's not something extra you do, but actually looking after yourself becomes an essential part of, how you do business. And for the supporters, right? So for the VCs, we have now VCs who are also investing actually in supporting entrepreneurs to avoid burnout, because they clearly see it as a way to de-risk their investment. What good is a business? Everybody always says they're investing in the idea, but also in the people taking it forward. And so what good is the idea if you don't have the people any longer to take it forward?
Maybe Gerrit, a question to you, because as you mentioned before, you have been in a burnout based on building a VC-backed venture. And so Ute gives kind of all these recommendations about what you can do to avoid it. Where did you go wrong, and what are you doing different nowadays?
Wow, I could be here for an hour on that topic.
So the executive summary.
Yeah. I think that was my first venture-backed business, and it came with a lot of naivety. But it also, and it was something I was going to ask Ute about, but it also, I would say, I came into it with a false understanding of what that experience was going to be like. And I'm in my late 40s. I kind of grew up in a generation, especially being half American, where there's this like, you got to be the hardest working guy in the room mentality. And it's what I now affectionately call hustle porn, right? It's the Elon Musk saying you're chewing on glass and staring into the abyss, and the Gary Vaynerchuks of the world, right? So that was the narrative that was spinning around, and that was the narrative I was brought up with from my father as well. You have to work. So I took that and fully ran with it. And, it was okay at first, because it was a social impact venture. I was so extremely motivated by it and passionate by it. Where it all started to change for me was when I started raising millions in venture capital. The organization grew. We were enterprise. We were dealing with Fortune 500 companies. I thought everything had to be perfect. I was the first guy in and the last guy out every day. And interestingly, it took many years of reflection, but the big trigger for me happened when I realized that it wasn't just me, and my mental health was becoming contagious. And because I was telling my employees, like, don't do what I do. This is my business. I own 70% of this business. Like, just because I'm here early and leaving late, go home to your families. I set this tacit expectation to my entire team. And it's when I started seeing, the 25 other people in my office starting to suffer, is when it kind of became unbearable for me, because I realized it wasn't just me wrecking me, and it was me having an impact on others. Of course, years later, I realized exercise suffered, probably more alcohol consumption for social and business events, like eating in airports and traveling and, living in hotels 200 days a year. So there was this kind of, I guess, all of the negative influences were coming from every direction, but it wasn't, in the end, the health and fitness was a symptom, and it wasn't the cause. The cause for me was this underlying stress that I was, hurting the people that I was actually trying to help. And then the purpose started to disappear. And, it becomes this snowball in a way. If the people at the top that are leading the organization and setting the tone and setting the culture, if they're unhealthy, I think it inevitably, the whole organization starts to fall apart. So what Ute has been talking about is really interesting to me, because I think there was such a history in management theory looking at the firm as the unit of analysis and not looking at the individual as much as a key component and a key driver of the firm, specifically the entrepreneur. So I think, the big message for me is like, for founders is like, they have to take care of their health, happiness, and well-being, because in the end, that is going to not only affect the outcome of the business, but it's going to affect the livelihoods and the well-being of all the people around them. And for me, that was just, as an empath, I think that was just too much to bear.
Yeah. And now the snowball is again running because you're building a new venture. So because Ute was saying you need to identify early the signals and make sure that you have this discipline to avoid that you get into this hamster wheel. So what kind of strategies do you apply to make sure that you don't get again into the hamster wheel?
It's funny, I was meeting with a founder in my portfolio last night, and I had this very conversation, and I distill it down to two very simple things. And it's that I protect the two things that I can't buy, and that's my health and my time. And if I structure my time, and I'm very disciplined with the way I manage my time and my schedule, and of course I maintain my health and fitness, and I eat right and sleep and exercise. I track everything meticulously as well. I'm totally a data nerd when it comes to that. But more importantly, what I do now is, I used to have my work schedule, and then I tried to schedule in my non-work stuff, and I flipped it. So what I have now is like, I have hours blocked off in my calendar. This is like wife time, and this is me time and exercise time. And that is the part that's non-negotiable, because I know if I don't make that non-negotiable, the work will eventually creep into that. And by prioritizing life outside of work above work, that gives me kind of a bit more ownership, and I don't have the risk of, deadlines and uncertainties taking over.
Yeah. Ute, does that make sense to you, that strategy, or do you see a risk towards failure?
No, I think, and on a personal level, so I've also gone through a burnout, and that was really the way to crawl out of it. It's probably the best way to describe it, is to get clarity about your goals in life eventually, right? Do you want work to take everything over, or do you find it valuable to spend time with your loved ones, which sounds crazy, but also as academics, I don't want to put us on the same level as entrepreneurs, but our work has very few boundaries, and we can always do more. And it is interesting from what you said, Gerrit, that also for me, it was one of the triggers was I actually was doing something, where I felt, okay, this has more meaning. I'm actually supporting others through a very difficult phase. And and kind of just making this choice of, right, I did exactly what you said. I blocked time, and I said, I'm not going to try, at least for a while, not to work on weekends any longer. When something comes in and I'm committing to something, then something else needs to go out of my agenda, because there is no more space for any, additional things. And I said yes too often to too many things. And that meant I was working late in the evening or on the weekends. And that didn't make for anything that, I'm not going to say work-life balance, because that's a very subjective thing, but it kind of impaired, it had negative effects on the loved ones around me. And I think that's why it has to stop.
I think you mentioned something interesting as well, too, is, how I'm not going to work on weekends anymore. I'm not going to work on late nights anymore. And that actually doesn't bother me as much, because what I've deliberately done is I've amortized my recovery. So what I used to do is I would work all week, and then I would take the weekend and I would do my sport, and I would eat right and exercise and whatnot. And I realized that 2-3 days of recovery couldn't make up for the 4 or 5 days of grinding. So now what I deliberately do is I block it off every single day, because that's helping to mitigate the effects of the stress each day. So by midday Saturday, I'm normal again. And I can see it in my HRV. You know, I wake up Monday morning and it's really high, and over the course of the week, it starts to drop and drop and drop. But it used to drop precipitously. And now, because I have a 2-hour break every day where I'm exercising and going for a walk in the sunshine and spending time with my loved ones, it's a much more gradual and slower decline. And I think that's what a lot of entrepreneurs miss is because our society and our culture is set up that Monday to Friday you work, Saturday, Sunday you rest. But I think in a high pressure environment with a lot of uncertainty where work can easily take over, that becomes extremely problematic because you never know. There may be that Sunday where you have to prepare for a big meeting or a pitch on Monday.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really in terms of kind of getting a handle on the physiological effects of stress, that's really the strategy that works best, right? Doing a little bit every day as opposed to, trying to block off time. And that kind of responds to how our physiology works. So that's absolutely. And if you also, one of the indicators is not just if you don't track your heart rate, but maybe you kind of get a sense of sleep. So if you on the weekend sleep disproportionately longer than during the week, so it's kind of you're trying to make up for a sleep deficit. That's also a sign that, somehow the balance isn't quite right because you can't recoup all the missed sleep within 2 days. And so, yeah, if you constantly feel exhausted, which is what happens even if you had a weekend off, but if you kind of overstretch yourself during the week, then you're not productive.
Maybe I want to briefly touch upon something that Gerrit said, that he comes from this hustle culture, where it was kind of seen as good to work very hard, to hustle. I think today, especially in Germany, and I don't know to what extent you're still following that kind of discussions, there's a kind of the opposite discussion, namely a discussion about Generation Z, and that they are not willing to hustle, and that they are actually sitting on a beach in Bali, surfing and building a startup at the same time. And then I would say you have some people in the venture scene. We had, for instance, Frank Taylor on the podcast, who is very critical about that approach, who is saying like, if you're not willing to hustle like crazy, you will never build a successful startup. So we see kind of a different discussion going on where I would say the generation we are, like the 40 plus, is looking a bit at Generation Z and thinking like, guys, please don't start talking about a 4-day week. You need to work hard if you want to accomplish something. I don't know, to what extent, what is your position in that discussion? Do you have any opinion about that?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about entrepreneurship, or, in all its different forms, is that there's space for everyone. So, if you decide that what's important in your life is the beach in Bali, and you also want to, do a startup along the way, I mean, you're not hurting anybody. So why not? And for somebody else, you may not achieve the unicorn status with that, but maybe that's not what you want in life, and that's fine. And I really think that's the great thing about entrepreneurship, that you can tailor the work if you do it right and don't let the work take over. You can tailor it to what you find important. And, we live in a society where that should be possible and great. And I think actually I would flip it if we kind of emphasize this hustle and grind culture too much. We're actually losing out with quite significant economic implications. We're losing out on a large part of potential entrepreneurs who will never select and opt into entrepreneurship because they don't see themselves as doing that type of work. And that maybe Generation Z, I know also that for many women entrepreneurs, they're often put off because all the role models we seem to discuss are the Elon Musk type white men. They don't see themselves represented. There's a large share of ethnic minority who kind of think, oh, this isn't me. I have a different value set. And so, if all those people, even if they're just in quotation marks self-employed, they still create a job for themselves and may get a meaningful life setting out of that. So why not? Who are we to judge? And for policymakers, I think that's a real should be a real consideration, because we know in the UK, for instance, immigrants start on businesses at a higher rate compared to the domestic population. And, if they go down the route of employing people, they're creating jobs, they're creating economic value.
Mhm. I'd like to ask you a question, because you have such rich experience in different contexts internationally and in different cultures. And I want to throw a sociological variable in there and kind of get your feedback on it. As a half American, half German I've built companies in 4 different countries. There's one variable that I find to be very, very interesting in how it affects entrepreneurs, and it's the culture around failure. Have you seen any research or participated in any research that looks at correlations between failure culture and the stressors and the challenges that entrepreneurs have in their journeys?
So we're just starting to look at that, is the honest answer. But what I can tell you is some research I did actually for my PhD was quite interesting. So we looked at what sort of cultures create more entrepreneurs. So just a very basic startups, innovative startups, opportunity startups, so that sort of thing across countries. And so if I'd asked you, you'd probably say most entrepreneurial country in the world, best culture. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I know this is a trick question, but I would say probably for high growth entrepreneurship, I would say the US.
Right. Yes. So, and the US is typically, it's an individualistic country, very performance oriented. What you see is that the level of startup, opportunity startups, all of that is actually highest in countries that have something what we call a socially supportive culture, which is more forgiving, which tolerates, if you make a mistake, where people are supportive. And in a very simple term, they're just nice, but it means it's easier to get in touch even with strangers. And if you think of entrepreneurship at large, most entrepreneurs are actually helped by the 3 F's, family, friends, and fools, who give either a helping hand, so instrumental support, maybe a bit of investment, a lot of emotional support. And so it's in those sort of cultures that entrepreneurship seems to thrive. And I would go out on a limb. I think that may also generalize ultimately to what sort of cultures we see supporting entrepreneurs' well-being.
Yeah, makes sense.
Ute, you were talking before about strategies to avoid burnout, to deal with stress. And the strategies that you mentioned, I would say, sound all quite reasonable and healthy. Now, when we look, especially I think to Silicon Valley nowadays, we see also another approach that is applied by entrepreneurs, namely they start taking specific drugs like ketamine to deal with depression, or they take all kinds of supplements to kind of compensate for the lifestyle they have. Is there already any research out there that says something about the implications of that, or is it too early for that?
Oh, wow. So I think 2 answers. The first answer, I'm actually a strategic advisor to something called the Founder Mental Health Pledge, which comes out of Silicon Valley, which has signed up over 600 organizations. And the point is to destigmatize conversations around mental health, founder mental health. The VCs signed up on that. And the second aim is to actually make mental health expenses business expenses, so that it becomes very natural that you spend money on yourself, so to speak, and invest in your own well-being. From my perspective, and everybody's different, investing that into drugs, I don't think is the best way forward, both because all medicines have side effects, but also there's just a new wave of studies that came out here. For instance, if you take antidepressants, actually getting off the antidepressants is really difficult, and not all people react the same way, but there are certain side effects that actually eventually make falling back into depression more likely. So I guess there is, as usual in life, no quick fixes. And so, I think everybody needs to make an informed decision. But I think in the long run, kind of building up daily routines might be a more sustainable path to well-being and thriving in entrepreneurship. But it is certainly true, I guess, with all the discussion, we talked about building up routines, going regularly for a walk, kind of checking your sleep and all of this. I think what I don't want people to take away, this is like another to-do. It's another hard goal that they have to meet. I think there's also an important kind of, there's a need for self-compassion, right? So if you sleep badly a night, that's just life. The world doesn't come to an end. You're not going to be super stressed the next day. You can function without one poor night, with one good night of sleep. So it's
No,
also
that's a very good point, because to be honest, I'm a person that doesn't have any trackers. And why? Because I think I will get very stressed by these trackers. So if the trackers sound indicating that you had a bad night's sleep, I would start worrying about that. Whereas now, simply because I don't know, I don't worry about it. So that I see sometimes as a potential downside of really tracking all these things, that it becomes a goal as such. And in that way, it actually contributes to your stress instead of avoiding the stress.
Yeah. And that's really where you need to know yourself. So if you are somebody who would then kind of beat themselves up if not reaching the 10,000 steps or whatever, I think we've reduced this to 5,000 at the moment. The research is still ongoing. This is the other thing. All these targets, because of course we need to have some rules of thumb, but there is a load of individual variation, right? Some people only need 7 hours, other people need 8.5 hours sleep. So it's really also a process of finding out, but then also being compassionate about it. And the same with the goals, or, I work with the short break system. I can click this away sometimes when I'm in deep concentration writing something. I'm very good at clicking this away, but I'm also mindful that, after 2 hours and it comes up again, I'm thinking, okay, I've clicked it away so many times. I now need to have a break. And actually every time I find it does benefit, kind of when I come back, I seem to have a much quicker way into whatever I was trying to do and solve it much more quickly. And I think once you build up these experiences, it becomes self-reinforcing, right? So then that's really what you want. That's the spiral you want to go down. You don't want to go down okay, I need to work more because I haven't achieved that particular goal this day. I need to spend 2 more hours. Then you don't get enough sleep. Maybe you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning because you're still thinking about the problem. And then, that's not been restful. The next day you're trying again to work on this, but because you're so exhausted, you can't, think of anything good to do there. You get stuck, you get frustrated. You beat yourself up. Maybe you're not eating well because you're frustrated. You're eating all sorts of high energy things that make you feel better short time. And you can see how that then spirals out over the long term. So everybody has a bad day. We even have a bad week where you may throw all of this away. But then it's in the long term, the next week, you make a kind of conscious choice to be kind to yourself and give yourself a bit of space and the breaks you need, a bit of more exercise and so forth.
Yeah, I think you touched on a great point. There's so much dogma that's taking place right now, especially as we do have these technologies at our, in our hands. I noticed a lot of the entrepreneurs that I gave these fitness trackers to were really uncomfortable when they actually started seeing the data behind them, and it was indeed stressing them out. And to me, you have to combine this type of data with an evolving sense of self-awareness, right? It doesn't work without that. What I tell a lot of entrepreneurs is, we get in this habit of getting into deep focus. We get really deep into the weeds and into the details and lost in execution, and being able to, whether it's 5 minutes every hour or a couple times a day, being able to zoom out to the 10,000 foot view and look at the big picture, including yourself within that big picture. And you start to really understand the significance or the importance, because sometimes tasks that seem so, immediately important, and when you zoom out, you realize it's just a small piece of a much bigger picture. So we're going to get more and more data. We're going to get more and more technology to enable us. But my big fear is that, we become less aware of the psychological tools that are at our disposal, right? The being able to kind of see ourselves through different lenses, zoom out, see the big picture, reframe. I love Brad Stulberg talks about this, the growth equation: stress plus recovery equals growth, right? It's kind of like in the gym, your muscles don't grow from lifting weights, your muscles grow sleeping that night. And I think there's similar muscles that entrepreneurs have as well, and you can think of it in the different layers of well-being. That same algorithm applies to the physical, to the mental, to the emotional. And, stress plus mindfulness is going to create wisdom and deeper awareness, but really having that ability to look to look at the big picture, to take a mindful kind of approach to things, I think is going to be that combined with data can be really, really powerful. But if you're missing that piece, you're probably just going to exacerbate the problem in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, you do need to make space, right, to consciously reflect on where you're at, and to experience that growth. Just running down the hamster wheel every day, every week, you kind of lose sight of what your long-term aims are. So it's also, I guess, the one plea I would make is just kind of make space every once in a while to make sure you're still on track with what you actually set out to do.
Great.
Yes.
Awesome.
I think this was a great conversation, and both Gerrit and Ute, also thanks for being your openness in kind of your own struggles. To be honest, I didn't yet have a burnout, and of course, sometimes you come close to it, and I think I'm lucky to some extent to avoid it. I think it's also part of being lucky, If you sometimes have circumstances that come together, it can happen even if you have the best intentions to avoid it. So I don't think it's something to be proud of if you didn't have it, but you're also a bit lucky. But really, thank you for sharing openly how you have dealt with it, because I think that can really help our audience. Now, to end the episode, we always have the same question, Ute. We want to ask you if you have specific books or podcasts that you can recommend, stuff that is on your table at the moment before you go to sleep.
Probably nothing you want to read. It's about how, so it's a bit controversial book, but it's about over-medicating on mental illness and actually seeing ill-being and, being down as part of the normal human experience. Yeah. So I think it's a fine line. If you really have clinical depression, you clearly need medication. That's it. Yeah. But I think over the long term, you also then need support. There are really good therapies. Cognitive behavior therapy has really good evidence base behind it to actually, get back into your life. So I think it's both, when we talk about mental health and well-being, I think in any population, we just need to be mindful that we're not going to be happy every day. That's not human, but it's also not human to feel horrible every day. So it's about finding the balance. In a way, you need the downsides to also know the upsides. And I think my big plea for entrepreneurs is just be mindful of that there are ups and downs. And when the downs become too deep and too long, do something about it. Maybe build up little routines. They don't take a lot of time, so that you kind of safeguard your well-being and build a flourishing company for yourself and for others.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in our current society with Instagram and other social media, it's not always easy to realize that being down sometimes is also perfectly okay, not?
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here, for sharing all your insights that you have, also from the academic perspective. I think that's very valuable also for our audience. And so I hope our listeners also enjoyed this podcast, and we hope to have you all back for our next episode. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.